The shadow of the crystal cage. The sky hung over Blackwood Manor like the lid of a leaden coffin. A dense fog, swallowing the horizon, drifted like a ghost among the naked branches of centuries-old oak trees, piercing the Gothic towers of the manor into the sky like threatening spears. The wind, howling as it crashed against the stone walls, mimicked a groan torn from the house's very lungs. Alice stood motionless before the floor-to-ceiling window of the colossal library. The silk robe she wore draped down her frail shoulders as if it were the only thing holding her upright. Her reflection in the glass was faint, much like the presence she had felt within herself lately. The storm outside was more orderly than the chaos inside. The multi-billion-dollar inheritance wasn't just numbers in bank accounts. This legacy was a pile of ancestral sins, unpaid debts, and secrets permeated into the walls. After her father's death, this massive estate had collapsed onto Alice. Everyone saw her as the lucky golden girl, yet she was a bird trapped behind golden bars. Lawyers, distant relatives, and business partners circled her like vultures, waiting. Beneath every congratulatory card lay a threat. Behind every smile hid a sharpened tooth. The heavy mahogany door at the other end of the room creaked open soundlessly, but Alice didn't turn. She knew who had entered the room by the shift in air pressure and the heavy scent of perfume spreading through the room. Elena, her stepmother. Her father's final mistake. Elena's presence was like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Even as she walked in, she asserted a claim of ownership. The thud of her heels on the parquet floor said, "This is mine." Through her reflection in the glass, Alice saw Elena standing behind her, examining her with those cold, calculating eyes. Not a single word was spoken between them. Everything to be said had been exhausted years ago. Elena's gaze drifted to the mannequin holding the wedding dress prepared for Alice's upcoming nuptials. The white lace gleamed in the dim light, not as a symbol of innocence, but of a sacrificial ritual. Elena walked toward the mannequin and ran her fingers over the lace. There was no affection in this touch, only a merchant inspecting her goods. Alice felt her fingers grip on the glass turn white. In this house, within this fortune, Alice was just a name. The real power lay in the shadows, in Elena's ice-cold hands. The next morning, the manors surrendered to feverish activity. It was the wedding day. The corridors were overflowing with servants carrying bouquets of flowers, silver candelabras, and crystal goblets. Yet there was no joy in this commotion. Rather, the tense discipline of a military operation prevailed. Everything had to be flawless, because the polish of the Blackwood name had to hide the rot underneath. Alice sat in the middle of her room, in front of the vanity table. The face in the mirror was a stranger to her. The powder applied to her pale skin had transformed her from a living human into an antique porcelain doll. Hairdressers and assistants around her shaped her hair and placed her veil with a silent choreography. Alice's eyes were fixed on the antique clock in the corner of the room. With every swing of the pendulum, it seemed to be counting down not the time, but the approaching disaster. In the outside world, beneath the massive tent set up in the garden, the cream of society had begun to gather. Champagne corks were popping, and fake laughter flew through the air. Everyone wanted to see the billionaire Aris. Alice, meanwhile, was trying to breathe inside a lace collar buttoned up to her throat. Her enemies were outside, or so she thought. She could hear the whispers. They were talking about the size of her fortune, her husband's luck, and her father's dubious death. But the real threat wasn't in the crowd, but in the room at the end of the hall. Elena had been missing since the early hours of the morning. This wasn't her style. Her control freak stepmother should have been personally micromanaging every detail on the wedding morning. This absence caused cramps in Alice's stomach. Silence was Elena's most dangerous weapon. One of the maids cast a trembling final glance at Alice and left the room. Alice remained alone with her image in the mirror. Her pupils had dilated with fear. She felt like prey. The armor of wealth did not protect her. On the contrary, it made her a brighter, more visible target. She stood up, dragging the heavy skirts of her wedding dress, and went to the window. She looked at the crowd below. They were all masked. They were all hungry. And at that moment, a scream coming from the depths of the manor sliced through the rhythm of the wedding music like a knife. The scream wasn't shrill. It was a muffled, terror-filled cry. The sudden silence formed by the cutting of the music made the scream's echo even more chilling. Alice's heart began to beat as if it would shatter her ribcage. The sounds of running in the hallway, doors slamming and whispers turning into chaos, lasted only seconds. When Alice stepped out of her room, a crowd had gathered in front of the room at the end of the hall, Elena's dressing room. Servants were covering their mouths and backing away. The head of security had set up a barricade in front of the door, but he couldn't stop Alice from approaching. She was like a ghost moving through that dark corridor in her white wedding dress. She looked inside through the doorway. The image was branded into her mind with a hot iron. Elena lay on her back in front of the full-length mirror. Her emerald green dress was lost within a dark red shadow widening on the floor. Beside her head lay a heavy, overturned bronze statue. But what was terrifying wasn't the blood. It was Elena's open eyes. The expression in those eyes consisted of shock and a dull rage. Even in the moment she was caught by death, she seemed angry that control had been taken from her hands. Alice held onto the doorframe. Bile rose to her throat. A murder. In her own home. On her wedding day. Her greatest enemy, her greatest nightmare, now lay on the floor covered in blood. Yet she felt no relief. On the contrary, she felt an invisible hand gripping her throat tighter. Elena was dead, but her shadow had grown even larger. Now the questions would begin. Police, detectives, media. That safe glass bell had been shattered. Who was the killer? How had they gotten inside? Or was the killer already inside? Alice's mind overflowed with terrible scenarios. She began to look at everyone around her with suspicion. Maybe Elena wasn't the target. Maybe the real target was herself, and the killer had struck the wrong person in the dark. This thought made Alice's knees give way. As she collapsed to the floor, the white skirts of her wedding dress spread over the dusty carpet of the corridor. By the time the blue and red lights of the police sirens began to dance on the manor walls, the wedding atmosphere had completely transformed into a crime scene. The guests had been sent away, and the house was buried in silence. However, this was not a peaceful silence. It was the tense silence of waiting before a storm. When Detective Aris entered through the main door, it was obvious from every demeanor of him that he didn't belong in this place. The crumpled gray overcoat he wore stood out like a stain in this excessively luxurious and sterile environment. His face was expressionless, filled with deep lines bearing the fatigue of years and the traces of brutality he had witnessed. He didn't like to talk. Observation was his native language. Aris didn't go directly to the crime scene. First, he watched Alice, who was cowering in a corner of the great hall. The young woman still hadn't taken off her bloody wedding dress. She was sitting in an armchair, constantly clasping her hands together, squeezing until her knuckles turned white. Her eyes were focused on the void, but her body flinched at the slightest sound. Aris knew this body language. This wasn't just grief, this was pure fear. The detective climbed the stairs with heavy steps. When he entered the crime scene, he inhaled the metallic scent of blood in the air. Every detail was a piece of a puzzle in his mind. The broken statue, the drag marks on the carpet, the pieces of skin under Elena's fingernails. The killer wasn't a novice, but it wasn't planned either. This was a murder of rage, a moment of explosion. Aris checked the layer of dust on the dresser with his gloved fingers. Then he walked slowly around the shadow of blood on the floor, as if he were holding a silent dialogue with the victim. Downstairs, Alice's fear had hit the ceiling. She could feel the detective's footsteps above her head. Every step was like a blow to her heart. Will he find me? Alice thought. Will he find the killer and save me, or am I the killer's target? When Aris came down, their eyes met. The detective's gaze was sharp and cold like a scalpel. He was trying to descend into the depths of Alice's soul, to illuminate the darkest corners she hid. Alice averted her eyes. This man was dangerous, even more dangerous than the killer, because the killer only took lives. This man took the truth. The interrogation process took place not in a formal room, but in the manor's dim library. Aris sat across from Alice, but asked no questions. He just noted some things in his notebook, then raised his head and looked at Alice. This silence created a pressure heavier than 1,000 questions. Alice's mind was foggy. Hours passed, and the killer still hadn't been found. Every shadow in the house had turned into a potential assassin in Alice's eyes. What if I'm next? This thought was gnawing at her brain. She had the doors locked and the windows covered, but she didn't feel safe. Detective Aris wandered through the house like a shadow, exchanging brief glances with the servants, touching the paintings on the walls, as if he were trying to read the memory of the house. Toward midnight, Alice found the detective in the corridor, in front of the door to her own bedroom. Aris was examining the doorknob. Alice held her breath. The detective turned to her. He held a small, shiny object in his hand, a button, a pearlescent, custom-made wedding dress button. Alice's heart felt like it stopped. That button, it belonged to her own wedding dress. Aris slowly turned the button between his fingers. Then he took a step toward Alice. The distance between them closed. The air thickened. There was no accusation in the detective's eyes. There was something more terrible, pity and understanding. Alice staggered backward. The fog curtain in her mind suddenly lifted. She tried to remember that morning, the argument with Elena, her stepmother's humiliating words, her saying, "You never deserved this legacy," your father's weak, pathetic daughter. Her hands began to tremble. She looked at her palms. She had washed her hands repeatedly in the morning, but now, looking with her mind's eye, she still saw an imaginary redness at the base of her fingernails. Detective Aris did not hand the button to Alice. He put it in his pocket. This movement was like a wordless agreement, a silent judgment. Alice leaned her back against the wall. Her legs could no longer carry her. Her fear had changed shape. She was no longer afraid of the killer finding her, because the killer wasn't outside. The killer was beneath this skin. The gaps from the morning began to fill. Elena entering the room. Alice grasping the heavy bronze statue that came to hand. The silence of that moment. And the strike. Just once. The explosion of all those years. The suppressed anger. The humiliation in a single blow. Then, panic. The desire to forget. Her brain wiping that moment and replacing it with victim Alice, scared Aris. Alice lifted her head and looked at the detective.
Tears were not flowing from her eyes. There was only a deep void. The detective understood that Alice remembered. Aris slowly turned his back. He walked toward the exit of the library. Alice stood frozen. Wasn't he going to arrest her? Where were the handcuffs? The detective stopped at the door. He turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder, not at Alice, but at the massive family portrait on the wall. In that painting, Alice's father stood with an authoritative expression. Aris knew that this house, this fortune, was a kingdom where even justice could be bought, where truths could be swept under the rug. Or perhaps he had decided that leaving Alice alone with her conscience in this massive, cold prison was a greater punishment than iron bars.
When Detective Aris left the manor, the rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy. He got into his car and drove away without looking back. What he would write in his report, insufficient evidence or unknown perpetrator, blended in the darkness of the night. Alice returned to her room. She had taken off the wedding dress. Now she wore a simple black dress. She stood in front of the mirror. There was no trace left of that timid expression from the morning on her face. In her eyes, there was a cold, steel-like glint similar to Elena's. She took the comb from the vanity table and began to slowly comb her hair. Her fear was over. Her anxiety had vanished. The enemies outside were unimportant now, because she had destroyed her greatest enemy, the weak girl inside her and the tyrant who ruled her. Alice smiled slightly at her reflection in the mirror. This smile wasn't warm. It was like the spasm on a corpse's face. The inheritance was truly hers now, not just the money. The darkness, silence, and sins of this house were now hers as well. She walked to the window. She looked down at the outside world, at the world of those small, ordinary people. She was no longer a victim, nor was she a hunter. She had become Blackwood Manor itself, cold, unreachable, and full of deadly secrets. She turned off the light. The darkness embraced her like an old friend. Silence became the only real sound in the room. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story.